This is a Film Stories original podcast. Hello and welcome back everyone to the Xcast X-Files Podwatch. This is episode 52 and today we are covering the postmodern Prometheus and Christmas Carol. I am Tony Black once again and I'm joined once again for the second day running by Mr. Darren Mooney.
It feels like it's been forever since we talked.
I know, time just goes at its own speed and, you know, people wouldn't realise it's been just 24 hours since we did this live. Remember, of course, we're, recording live. And
whenever you are listening to it, that is when we were recording it. Tony keeps all of us podcasters in boxes. We're wired up directly to your earphones, speaking into those... it's like those milk carton phones you used to have. That's exactly how the podcast works as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. You know, one might almost say that there's quite a postmodern way of podcasting, really, isn't it? Which is quite appropriate, Darren. Great segue there, wasn't it? That was a good segue, wasn't it? You know,
seamless
segue into our first episode of the two we're going to talk about today, which is the postmodern Prometheus. One of the most legendary episodes of the X-Files, written and directed by Chris Carter. Filmed in black and white, and Mulder and Scully go to a small town in the middle of Middle America, it seems, in order to solve a mystery that leads to a take very much on Mary Shelley and and a very unusual sad monster. It's renowned, this one, and I think it would be on a top 10 probably of most X-Files fans' lists. Would it be on yours, Darren?
No. I feel really bad saying it, because it's one of those things where I really, really like it. I just don't like it as much as everybody else seems to like it. I think it's absolutely brilliant as a formal piece of television. I think it makes some very serious mistakes that maybe it sort of like cast a bit of a shadow over it that I don't think exist on, say, Carter's other equally experimental works, like, say, Triangle, for example. Triangle would be much more likely to take my Chris Carter experimental slot than Postmodern Prometheus. But to be honest, I really like it, and I think it's a fantastic accomplishment. Like, in terms of 90s television, right? Imagine airing a black and white episode, like, with Jerry Springer and a Cher impersonator, riffing on, like, James Whale's Frankenstein, and just sort of broadcasting that in prime time. Like, at the same time that Fox is trying to sell this big-budget, multi-million-dollar blockbuster movie starring these characters. It's so delightfully esoteric. I'm amazed that Carter got away with it, and I'm glad that he did. And I think it sort of set a tone for, like, later seasons to do that sort of more experimental sort of storytelling. So, for example, in the 6th season, you had, obviously, Triangle. In the 7th season, you had X-Cops, for example. And even in the 9th season, you had Improbable. But I think that it made the show a lot more comfortable. I think it's one of Carter's best directorial efforts. And I think that, to be honest, it was the 100th episode that aired, I believe, maybe, perhaps? Or was that Unusual Suspects?
So. Oh, no, it might have been Unusual Suspects, yeah, actually. I think it might have been. It's around that number.
It's around that mark, but it's a very, very cool episode, and it's an episode that you can tell Carter cared a great deal about, because, like, Carter has loved Frankenstein. Like, Carter's recurring fascination is Frankenstein, going back to even the script for, say, Young at Heart. But obviously, like, the framing device that existed in Colony and Endgame, even, like, the fascination that the mythology has with, like, hybridization and sort of this genetics gone mad, I tell you, and just sort of framing that through the device of this sort of old 30s sort of comic book Universal Studios sort of movie, I really, really like. And actually, one of the things that disappoints me about the recent high definition releases of the episodes, which are generally superb and generally spectacular, they've all been remastered in high definition. They've been remastered in widescreen, which, to be honest, I don't really mind too much, because a lot of people are like original aspect ratio sort of purists. It should be released in the form in which it was broadcast. I'm more open-minded because I think that having it in widescreen makes it accessible to modern audiences, and I think that's a trade-off that you make. But I'm really disappointed that the postmodern Prometheus was remastered in widescreen, if only because the movies that it's riffing on, like the James Whale, the Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, were both 4:3 aspect ratio, and I feel like if you're going to do black and white, having it in widescreen sort of loses or lessens the effect just a little bit for me. But that's my film nerdy complaint. But anyway, what about you? What do you make of postmodern Prometheus?
I think you make some fantastic points there. Really, I think it's. I think you mentioning about how it's amazing Chris Carter got away with it. I think it's simply the fact that the X-Files at this point was at its absolute peak. In terms of popularity, in terms of fandom, the movie wasn't far away. This was it was just firing on all cylinders. And also, if you think about the episodes we've talked about in season 5 so far, like yesterday when we talked about Unusual Suspects and Detour, and if you think about the episodes that are coming. Really, the standard normal X-Files episode where Mulder and Scully go and investigate a case are not the norm anymore. They have become the oddball episode. You get one in a couple of weeks called Schizogeny.
And it's not great. Not to spoil us, yeah.
It's boring, and it's just because it's a normal bog standard X-File, and all the rest of them pretty much all through season 5 are episodes that in the old days would have been really curio episodes.
Yeah, it would have been very special episodes.
They would have been very special episodes, but now the X-Files has got such confidence and such breadth of storytelling that it's pretty much doing that every week. It's coming up with something that's a bit format breaking, or is a bit unusual, or is a bit character centric, or is a bit mythology, or is a bit, it's a sequel like with Kitsunegari, which is coming up soon. So to do something like the postmodern Prometheus, yes, it's unusual even for the standards of this show, but at the same time it's coming at a point in the show's life where experimentation was happening pretty much every week, and I think it kind of popped up at the right time, I think, for the show. I don't think they could have done this before, or oddly enough afterwards, because by the time you got into like the 6th and 7th season where fatigue was starting to show a little bit, and more in the 7th season I suppose, 6th season's really good, but I still think, again, if you tried to film this in LA, I don't think it would have been quite as good. I think the Vancouver setting again fits as well. I think there's a lot of components to it that really capture what all the things you said far better than I could, that Carter's trying to do.
Well, I think that, being honest, if you moved to Los Angeles, you'd have a bit more trouble finding like barn and sort of rural settings that look as good as this. But I think that like one of the things that's striking about Postmodern Prometheus is that it feels very much like a mission. It's once a mission statement for the X-Files, and something that feels profoundly personal to Carter. Like, I think that there's this recurring motif that runs through the 5th season of like reproductive horror, which has always been like something the X-Files have been very engaged with, going back to like the Erlenmeyer Flask, obviously, all the creepy kids in the 1st and 2nd season, and even stuff like Revelation in the 3rd season, and like the creepy kids in Herrenvolk. But in the 3rd season, in the 5th season, you really get this idea of like dangerous progeny, this idea that children are not always what you expect them to be. Like, so for example, you have All Souls, where the children of Seraphins are a plot point. You have stuff like Kill Switch, where a computer decides to kill its parent. You have Syzygy, which is the one that we talked about, where it's basically kids control killer trees. You have Mind's Eye, where it's like a kid basically sees through the eyes of her murderous father. And you have even stuff like, coming up, you have Christmas Carol and Emily, which, not to spoil what we're going to talk about in a moment, also hit on this idea of like what happens with kids. And I think Postmodern Prometheus ties into that even more explicitly, in that it's explicitly about kids and reproduction. And I think like part of my issues with it, and we'll probably talk about it in a moment, are how it handles that, because I don't think it handles that particularly nuanced or particularly sort of carefully. But I think that what it does is it hits on this idea, and I'm kind of curious, I'm cautious saying this because I don't want to read too much into what Carter's doing or what his state of mind would have been. But like at this point, the X-Files was an unstoppable pop culture machine. It had run 5 seasons. It was going to move at the end of the season from Vancouver to Los Angeles in order to keep running, to keep David Duchovny on board. Carter had originally planned for the show to run about 100 episodes or 5 seasons before transitioning to a series of movies, but Fox had convinced him, and he talks about this in interviews, to basically to keep running the show, or else they would find somebody who would run it for them. And he also promised Duchovny and Anderson that he would continue to run the show as long as they were on it. And part of me wonders if the anxiety running through the 5th season, which is the last season in Vancouver, and I think the last season Carter originally planned to make, is this idea of like, is Carter wondering what the X-Files is going to be after he's gone? Like, is he worried about like a hybridization or some sort of warping or distortion of the X-Files, that it's going to end up, and you get this like, even in later episodes, like say Milagro, for example, or even in Alone, or even in Audrey Pauly, you get this idea that Carter has this sense that he no longer exclusively owns these Mulder and Scully, and instead he owns like a version of them or an iteration of them that's constantly changing. And like, one of the things I like about the Postmodern Prometheus is that it's a story about, it doesn't really matter if this really happened. this can't really be an X-File that fits with the continuity of the show, because the moment that they discover the Great Mutato, like, the X-Files are unclosable forever, because, like, Mulder has proof of the paranormal. So it can't really be an X-File in that sense. But, like, there's this great discussion in the middle of the episode where Mulder and Scully have this conversation about truth, and it's something that's, I think, very true in the context of the 5th season, and I think becomes very true as the show goes on, which is, like, Mulder argues that, like, the Great Mutato is true, not in the sense that it is literally true, but in the sense that it is, and I quote here, believed to be true. Like, this idea that believing in something makes it real and tangible, and that, like, truth is not necessarily something that is literal. And I think that Carter then sort of runs with that throughout the rest of the show, but you can see in the 5th season, like, Mulder's skepticism, and sort of this idea of, like, the mythology and the paranoia and stuff. Like, the X-Files Mulder doesn't have to literally unearth truth. He has to find, like, perhaps a deeper spiritual truth, or something with a bit of meaning to it, or something with a bit of purpose to it. I think that, like, the Postmodern Prometheus is great because it's an episode that is fundamental to what the X-Files is, despite being something that you can't reconcile with the rest of the show. Duchovny has talked about how that great closing image of Mulder and Scully dancing in the dance hall, that's his favourite image from the show, or that's how he imagines the X-Files ending. Now, the X-Files might have run for 4 years after that and come back for a revival more than 20 years after that. But for Duchovny, that closing image of Mulder and Scully dancing to Walking in Memphis, that's the point. That's his defining X-Files moment. It doesn't matter that it's not in continuity. It doesn't matter that it's not the last episode of the show. It still has meaning to him because he invests meaning in it. And I think the Postmodern Prometheus really sort of gets that.
Yeah, it does. And I think it does tug at the heartstrings. You know, that final sequence with the Mutato and the Cher concert. And incidentally, Cher wishes she'd have done it. Apparently she was asked, or they approached her, and she said no, or she was busy. But she was a fan of the show, and she wished she'd have come and actually was in the episode, in hindsight. So, you know, it's a great episode. It's an unusual episode. It's a funny episode. It's a very individual episode for the X-Files. And yeah, I understand why it's a favourite of a lot of people. Okay,
I feel the need to jump in here and explain why I qualified my stuff at the start, because I feel like I haven't done that. So I'm very quickly going to say then, I think the episode is maybe a bit flippant towards the sexual assault that occurs throughout the episode. I think that it's a story that is about, like, abuse and assault, and it doesn't really handle that particularly well. I don't think it sort of delves into that a bit, and I think it's a little uncomfortable in a season that's about, like, Scully's about to discover that she has a child that was not conceived through her consent. And I think that, like, Postmodern Prometheus is essentially about that, and I don't think it tackles that with sort of the necessary nuance.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. And this, you know, there's a lot of people online who agree with that, actually, and who a lot of people have issues with the way Carter writes these kind of things in terms of women and stuff like that. And I'll be honest, I don't have a huge opinion on that. I really don't, and maybe that's my failing, really. But I've never looked at that episode and been angry about that, to be honest. So, but I can see why people would be. I can see why there'd be an alternate, argument there. But yeah, it's a memorable one, whether or not people love it or not. Really,
it's a beautiful episode. Like, it's beautifully constructed, and it's clearly a love letter to, like, Carter's inspirations, sort of like his pulpy stuff. It really is, and it's very, very joyful. Like the scene of the Mutato doing the risky business through the house, dancing to is it Gypsies, Champs and Thieves, or is it Sunshine? Sun ain't gonna shine anymore. But it's like just pure joy. Great. It really is.
It is, and it made me go and buy a Cher album. You know, so you know she's rolling. It's probably something like the best of Cher. Honestly, it could have been something like the best of Cher, because I wanted to get those tunes that I'd heard in the episode. So, you know, I was 15. You know, back in those days, you did buy the best of. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it.
I guess you could say Carter was sharing her music with a new generation.
Yes, but very good, very good. That's a perfect way to end our discussion on the Postmodern Prometheus and move on to a much less memorable episode, which is the second one we're going to talk about today, which is Christmas Carol, which is part one of a two-part, very Scully-centric mythology two-parter. This, obviously, is a Christmas set episode as well. Certainly part one of this, and the second part is Emily, which will be discussed tomorrow. But it's an interesting one because I think I think I've never really got on with this, although there are certain things in it I like. I do like. Obviously, it sees Scully go back to her own family and discover that maybe she actually has a daughter that she never really knew about in a possible sort of alien clone daughter called Emily. But I think the one thing I like the most about this is, well, firstly, I don't like it for this, but firstly, it's barely got Mulder in it. I think he appears for like a split second and that's it. It's pretty much solely focused on Scully. I think the bit I liked the most was the call from Melissa. I think that's the bit that really sticks in my mind, where she gets a call from possibly beyond the grave from her sister. And it is Melinda McGraw's voice as well. And that really sends chills down my spine. Similar kind of moment to when she sees her dad sitting in the chair in Beyond the Sea. But I think the rest of it, I don't know. It's never really one that I revisited a lot, to be honest.
I feel the need to qualify this by saying, I think, without sort of stepping on the toes of the people who'll be talking tomorrow, Emily is quite possibly one of the worst episodes of The X-Files I have ever seen. And so with that in mind, Christmas Carol isn't awful. I actually like Christmas Carol a lot more than I like Emily. And part of it's because it's completely unrelated to Emily in many ways. Like I like the quietness of Christmas Carol. I like the sort of you mentioned there the fact that it's so focused solely on Scully. I like the sort of character studiness. Like it's like Christmas with the Scullys. I like the sort of sense. There's this weird sort of like. The X-Files is an interesting show to talk about in terms of like its feminism, because in some ways it was very ahead of the curve and some ways it was less so. But I think one of the things I really like about Christmas Carol is it captures the sense of like the sense of the X-Files as a feminist show while also touching on some of the more kind of problematic aspects of it. So like I really like the sense that Scully... Well, first of all, it's a story about how women have been victimized and abused by men, basically, which is one of the recurring themes of mythology, but it's rendered here in a way that is very sort of grounded, in that it's obviously it's a woman is murdered because she refuses to surrender her child to government experiments, and her husband is complicit in it, and the state covers it up. And there's that really great, like, this recurring theme even of Scully, when Scully's investigating the case, that the male detectives and the male coroner are basically like, well, look, what are you talking about? You've got no idea what you're doing here. This is none of your business. Or even the wonderful shot where she goes to visit the house and the husband is there, and in the back over his shoulder there are two guys sort of talking and glancing at her, and this sort of subtle dismissive sort of attitude, that sense that like Scully is out of her element in a way that's not explicitly framed in terms of gender, but in a way that sort of like makes it very clear that she is in some way intruding into a world where men think they're in charge, or men sort of like are dismissive towards women, perhaps. And I think that like Christmas Carol covers that very, very well. And even obviously Bill Scully, who is the worst member of the Scully family by a considerable margin. Even his sort of attitude towards Dana, which is very sort of dismissive and patronizing. But I mean, I think that, and then on the other hand, you have the bit that never really sat well with me about Scully's arc in the 5th season, which is the idea that Scully, who was established in the first season as a woman who wanted a career, who was very professional, who didn't see herself settling down, who didn't really necessarily have lots of close personal friends, or they sort of dropped away as the X-Files ran on, but all of a sudden she wants a baby. And it just... I understand that in terms of like having that taken away from her, and maybe she would want it a bit more, but it feels like during the 5th season the writers really doubled down on this idea that Scully wants to be a mother in a way that like Mulder never really has a corresponding I want to be a father arc. Mulder never really sort of worries about that, but it's a sense that because Scully is the female lead, that somehow this has to be placed on her, and I've never really been comfortable with that, and I think that's part of my issue with Christmas Carol, and it gets a lot worse in Emily. And I think you can see that then leading to stuff like in the 9th season, the infamous my baby sort of writing that Scully gets, which I think doesn't flatter the character. But
No.
But like I don't love Christmas Carol, but I like it a lot more than Emily, and I like even the flashback of the little bunny, the dead bunny with the maggots eating away at it, like the glimpses of like Scully's childhood life. I think that there's a lot there that's kind of slow and not what you would expect from an X-Files episode, but I don't think it's diminished by that. And you were talking about how the 5th season is sort of like the series of off-format X-Files episodes, apart from that one that is terrible. And I think that like Christmas Carol is very much, it's as much an off-format episode almost as Detour or Unusual Suspects. Maybe not as much as Postmodern Prometheus, but like it's a Scully carried episode in which like she's basically having flashbacks of her time with her family, and she's coming to terms with where she is in her life, and in a way that I almost prefigures like all things in the seventh season. Like you can almost see this as a spiritual successor, or a spiritual sort of predecessor to that. And I think that I like that about it.
Yeah, I think you're probably right in the sense that it's a better episode than Emily. I mean, I always remember liking Emily a bit more because Emily's just got a bit more action. You know, I mean, I think as a younger man, it was more that Mulder's in Emily more. Now it's more about the conspiracy. There's clones. You know, there's it's Mulder going and basically smacking this guy's head around in an office. You know, being a bit Charles Bronson at one point. It's got things in it that I think I appealed to me more on a basic level. But I think in terms of a piece of drama and a piece of writing, Christmas Carol is probably the best of the two, and more of an actual, interesting piece of character work for Scully. So I think you're probably right, actually, and it will be interesting to do this one in more detail and to look deeper into Christmas Carol and Emily, because I think maybe I might find things down the line that I didn't find this time around, or I've never found before.
Okay,
so yeah,
red line here. Emily is the worst episode of television that Vince Gilligan has ever written.
Well, this had about half a dozen writers, though, didn't it? This has got John Shiban and Spotnitz and
I mean, Shiban's written Teso dos Bichos and El Mundo Giro, so he's you have to work very hard to hit lower than that. And Spotnitz, to be honest, Spotnitz makes some mistakes later down the line with, say, Demonicus, I think. But Gilligan, as a writer, is a pretty good writer. But I would argue Emily is probably the one script that I suspect he might want to do over on. That would be just my reading. If Gilligan ever needed a do-over or a mulligan, it was on Emily.
Well, I mean, Darren won't be around tomorrow to talk about Emily and eviscerate it, which is almost a bit of a shame now. I'm actually quite sad you're not. But yeah, Emily will be discussed in tomorrow's episode of the Podwatch, along with Kitsunegari, aka Fox Hunt, which that's not the name of the episode. The episode is called Kitsunegari, but it means Fox Hunt, which is the sequel. Yeah, which is sequel to Pusher, which is as everyone knows, my favourite episode, which we talked about some time ago. So that one that'll be two interesting, again, quite format-breaking episodes to talk about. So join us tomorrow, or not us, but join the Podwatch tomorrow for that. So until then, you can find me at AJ Blackwriter on Twitter. You can find the Xcast at the X_cast on Twitter, and find our Facebook group and page as well for more stuff. And Darren, where can people find you until you return on the Xcast Podwatch, which you for sure will?
You can find me online at Darren_Rooney. I co-host the 250, which is a podcast looking at IMDb's top 250 movies of all time, which is available on the Black Hole Media Podbean and on Twitter at the 250. I wrote a book on the X-Files, Opening the X-Files, a critical history of the original series, which is available from Amazon, Wordsmiths, anywhere that good books on the X-Files are sold, which is apparently a lot of places. So please check that out, or ask your local library.
Awesome stuff. Okay, well, we'll be back tomorrow for more X-Files Xcast pod watching, but until then, as always,